Hey, will do. Thank you, Connie. And again, thank you for opening this up to people outside of Patton College. And so if you're joining us today for the very first time from another college, we're delighted to have you. And also because this series isn't in any way a required workshop where people have to come to everything. Jodie and I were chatting about the fact that people will tune in and out at different points depending on their interests or their particular needs at any given point. But to try and keep that as seamless as possible, what we're going to try and do is just very briefly refer back to the major concepts that we already covered so that no matter when you join us, that information should feel like it's flowing quite naturally. So again, we're not going to repeat everything, we'll just refer back to it a little bit. And also, as before, we're going to hold the in-depth types of discussions until the end. And that's just trying to be respectful of your time so that if you get all of the information that you need, you can leave. If you want more information or you want to delve into it more deeply, then we can really do all of that together at the end. But as always, if we ever say anything that isn't clear or that requires, a little more explanation before you can go ahead and do stuff, or just before you can make sense of what we're trying to say, please don't hesitate to either raise your hand or to pop a question into the chat. And whoever isn't actually presenting at that point will keep an eye on it and interrupt. So that's what this is all about, is for us to say what you need to say when you need to say it. So please don't be shy about doing that. So just like a very brief recap of yesterday, we talked about the principles of backwards design. And for many of you, that was just a refresher course, thinking about designing your course, whether it's face-to-face or online, with the end in mind. So you're thinking about what do you want your students to know in terms of content and skills? What are they going to be able to know and do by the end of the course? And then how are you going to know that they can do that? So introducing the second step where you're thinking about how you're going to design assessments that provide evidence that the students know the content and can do the work. And then when you have those two things in place, we're going to be planning our learning experiences and instruction throughout the course. And so that's what we're going to go into in more detail today. So yesterday we just started with that very important part of thinking about your learning outcomes in terms of content and skill. What were the major things that you wanted your students to walk away with at the end of the course? And so what we're going to do today is start thinking about those individual course outcomes that you thought about for your homework, and breaking those down into module level outcomes. And then with that in mind, starting to map the course out, and then thinking about how we will know what this acceptable evidence looks like, what kinds of assessments might we consider. And we're actually going to go into that in more detail again on Friday, but this is just introducing the concept and then thinking about what kinds of learning experiences and instructions we're going to be introducing to our students. And so these things, this feels like quite a busy session, but hopefully because you've got the first part down, this is going to go quite smoothly. So over to you, Jodie.
Right, I remembered to unmute my mic today, so we're off to a good start, and we haven't restarted yet, so things are looking promising. So we're going to walk you through, like Meg said, breaking your outcomes into more module level outcomes, and then kind of planning and mapping out your course today. And a lot of times when we do these sort of sessions, we'll do the bigger assessment pieces first, but because of the layout of the sessions and our timing, we're starting here with this mapping. So if you're coming to Friday, we'll kind of fill in those pieces afterwards, but this is just thinking about taking all of your outcomes and organizing them organizing them in a way that you can deliver a clear, organized course. So it's a process, and we like to try to do things in a scaffolded way so that we can help our learners achieve those outcomes in the end. So our first step of this course mapping process is to really organize your outcomes. So sit down with them, take a look, and say, are there any skills, knowledge, abilities that students get from one of these outcomes that need to come first? So is there something that I have to present first to my students? What pieces can come next? And then where are those higher level outcomes that I want to save towards the end? So your first step is to take a little time and organize and almost kind of number and sort out your outcomes so that in your head, they make logical sense for your learners. The next thing you want to do is build those into units or modules. So we like to think about this as different buckets. So what are those big key concepts you'll be covering, and how can you kind of sort through your outcomes into these learning modules? And we do have typically 7 or 15 weeks in a course. At this point, you don't really need to be thinking about weeks, but more what chunks of content make sense to put together for my students so that they're getting all the early knowledge they need so that they can use and apply some of these concepts in more depth as the course goes on. We then will ask you, and we're going to give you all some time to practice this, to write module level outcomes. So we talked about course level outcomes, and many of you probably even have program level outcomes you're aiming for. But these module level outcomes are a little different because we get more into measurable pieces. So where your course outcomes may be broad and a bit more open-ended for students, these module level outcomes will have a measurable piece. And the idea behind module level outcomes is students can look at that and almost know exactly what they're going to do and how they're expected to do it. So this is where we kind of narrow down and dig into the nitty-gritty of what our students will be doing. And then finally, we'll map out our course into weekly modules. So we'll get more into this later again, but some modules or units may span multiple weeks. But for student learning, and particularly in the online space, we find it's nice if you can break things into weekly units so that they can really focus in on what it is they need to be doing that specific week. Some people will open up their course and let students, engage with everything, but in practice, we find that most students typically stick with the schedule and very few will work ahead. So giving them a consistent, clear week of work can be helpful for both you and grading and setting expectations and planning, as well as your students. So this is a look at the course map that I use. There's a number of instructional designers at OU, and we all have a very similar kind of mapping process. But if you've worked with Patrick or any of our other designers, the course map they've presented might be slightly different. This is just for planning, and a lot of people will take this course map and transition it into an outline for students, or they will take it and use it to build out Blackboard. And what we do in our office is we'll work with faculty to build out this course map so that it's easily translated into Blackboard. So you'll see it starts, that first column has the module, the topics, a module overview, which is usually just a little bit to explain it. And then the related course outcomes. So we'll show you an example of this here in a moment, but typically we just have people list the number. So if your course outcomes are numbered above, you can just add the course outcome number below. And we'll show you as well, sometimes these first two columns may say module 1, but be weeks 1 and 2. So again, those modules, like it's up here, modules can also be called units. In this field, all the language kind of overlaps and melds together. I worked with one faculty member who called them acts and scenes. So all we ask is that you're consistent in how you label. But they can span weeks, and some classes, a module will go 1.5 weeks, but you still need to present, or it's best practice, we find, to present that content 1 week at a time, just so students know what to expect. But laying this out helps kind of you see the big picture. There's this notes area and the grading criteria and assessment of mastery. And the reason it's built this way, again, is just so it's easily transferred into Blackboard. But you'll notice we have the outcomes, which is our first step, and then we jump over to assessment of mastery here. So when you're planning, you have to skip over the learning activities first. But again, that formatting is for later steps, and it's also, for those people who do translate this into something a little bit more consumable for students, it's easier than flipping columns around and moving things about. This grading method is something I added recently after working with Meg. It's always really good to think about how you're going to assess students, both for the students. So are you going to use a rubric? Is it going to be a checklist or a pass-fail, just credit? But it's also good for you to think about how much work on the back end you will have assessing your students, right? So we were working with someone a week ago who gave their students all these papers and ended up having over 1,000 papers to grade throughout the semester or something like that, and large papers. So having this grading method is both for you to know what you need to plan and develop, but also to kind of check your planning process to make sure that it's reasonable for you as well as your students.
Okay, so we thought if we shared an example. So those of you who were with us on Monday will remember that I shared some course outcomes from a physiology class. So they were listed up there in teeny tiny writing. Because what I want to do now is just think about taking one, and you're going to do this in just a second. You're going to take one of those learning outcomes for your course and think about breaking it down into the modules. And so what I've done here is, if you look at the map, you can see that I've highlighted number 2 because we're thinking about the course learning module in the first column is dealing with module or unit, depending on what you want to call it, 2. And this is week 2 and 3 that is talking about the cardiovascular system. And so again, it's the module overview is describing the cardiovascular system in the way that I had described it just for my course outcomes above. And I've just listed here that it's outcome number 2. So what we're doing then is thinking, okay, when I'm asking the students to describe the cardiovascular system and use the application to evaluate physiological scenarios, what does that actually mean? What am I actually going to be introducing to the students? And more importantly, what specifically do I expect my students to be able to know and do within this section that, as Jodie said, is measurable, something that I can actually evaluate? And so here I've broken that down, that when I come to, and this is a big section, so I do it over a couple of weeks. When I come to this section, here's where I'm going to start. I'm starting off with just getting them to understand the basics of how the cardiac cell, what it's composed of, what the different components do, etc. Then how that cardiac cell can contract, how a whole bunch of cardiac cells can work together to contract as the heart muscle and pump blood out into the arteries and send it all around the body. Then I'm thinking about how efficiently, in learning outcome number 4, cardiac output really speaks to how efficiently and effectively your heart is working. And it also leads into the development of blood pressure. And then I'm actually moving them up into their higher order thinking skills progressively. And now they're thinking about analysing quite a complex physiological diagram that if they can do this properly, it helps identify which part of the cardiovascular system isn't working well. And then I give them a case study that they have to be working through, or lots of different ones. So that's what they're going to be doing within this. And again, just as we scaffolded our big, broad course outcomes, as Jodie said, what do they have to do first before they can do anything else? I've done that too within this module. I started off at my very lower order thinking skills sections, just getting them to know their basic facts and understand them. And then you can see as we start moving through this module, we're moving up our Bloom's taxonomy into our understanding, application, analysis, and evaluation types of things. So we can go to the next slide. And if there's no questions, if you have any questions at the moment about this, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute your mic. Otherwise, we move on to the next slide.
And just so this course map template, for those of you who came in a little later, is linked in the chat. And if anyone can't see the chat for some reason, you can just shoot me an email, monk, MONKJ @ohio.edu, and I can send it along, as well as the slides.
Mm-hmm.
And Meg here, she added the Bloom's level, so she has remembering and understanding. That's a practice you are welcome to engage in, but you absolutely, you don't need to list those here. So the course map typically, again, is just for your planning purposes. Some people will take it and shift it over, but it's a nice thing to. I
really only added it here just for explanatory, just to help us think about organising our module learning outcomes. As Jodie says, I wouldn't normally put the Bloom's taxonomy next to that. That was just to kind of illuminate how I'm thinking about organising my learning outcomes. Thanks for pointing that out, Jodie. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so now what you're going to do is think about the course level outcomes that you worked on, and take one of them. Take the one that seems the most intuitive to you, or the one that you feel that you really have already fleshed out in a really good way, and think about what that's going to look like for the students when you get to that particular module that is dealing with that particular outcome, precisely what is in there. And then just thinking about roughly, and if you've taught this class many times before, you'll have a rough idea of how long this might take. If you're new to this, this can be the kind of scary, challenging part where you don't know exactly how many weeks it's going to take. And so you're making an educated guess based on your experience when you were learning it, and also always reaching out to your really invaluable colleagues to get their input and expertise on helping you formulate that. But for now, just do your best guess if you haven't taught the course before. And we're just going to take a few minutes. And if any questions occur to you as you're doing it, referring to that course map that Jodie mentioned, please just unmute your mic and ask away. Okay.
So I have a question. When it comes to the learning outcomes, we're talking about course learning outcomes, or are we talking about student learning?
So we started with the course. So those terms can be quite interchangeable.
Okay.
And the way that you're thinking about it at the moment is the course learning outcomes are those big things that are describing, and they're more precise than goals that have things like understand and appreciate and value, etc. They are actually talking about skill sets and content knowledge that you want students to be thinking about writ large. But here, when you're thinking about the module learning outcomes, I think it is probably more how we think about the actual student learning outcomes. At this point, they become measurable. They become actual specifics that the students are going to be doing to meet that course outcome. Does that make sense? In the way, like my module My course learning outcome was describe the cardiovascular system and use the application of knowledge to evaluate physiological scenarios. So it's quite concrete.
Yes.
Then in module learning ones, I'm really breaking that down. What do I mean by that specifically? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, so you may not have finished in all that time, and we're going to keep rolling just to move you further along through the process. But it is good practice to take some time and think about really engaging and figuring out what those more measurable steps for your students will be. And if you ever want feedback, Patrick Mose is typically your instructional designer for the Patton College if you're here from Patton. But we do have instructional designers who serve the entire campus. I'm helping Patrick out while he's on leave, so you're welcome to reach out to me in the meantime. Or if you're not sure who your instructional designer is, I can help guide you in the right direction. So we're going to talk briefly about alignment, and alignment can mean a lot of things, right? There's alignment between our course goals and maybe our programmatic goals. There's alignment between likely programs and then hiring accreditation bodies. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to talk about alignment as it relates to our course. So this is just zooming in and looking at our course, and specifically, this can be for the course as a whole, but also in the module level, you want alignment. So first, and this kind of has all the steps of backward design wrapped in, but it's a nice little visual, and it's what we'll refer back to quite often as you're thinking about designing your course. So you've developed your learning outcomes. They're clear, they're concise, they're where we want students to go. And as we work towards the next step, which is designing assessments, and during this presentation, we're going to talk more about module level assessments as opposed to the big summative assessments. But I should be able to look at those module level learning outcomes and your course outcomes and find the assessment that's aligned with it. So there should be a relationship between the learning outcome and the assessment as the learning outcomes where we want students to be. So those assessments should measure if the student has accomplished that learning outcome or not. Excuse me. So then, we've got our learning outcomes, we've got our aligned assessments, and our next step is to think, how can we get students from where they are to that point where they can achieve that assessment, right? What can they engage with? What can we create or find or use to help them get there? And that's the learning activities. So learning activities people see often and they think, oh, that's, discussions and things we're doing in class, but learning activities also can encompass materials and different things. So every module should be aligned. I should look at your module level outcomes and then jump over to assessment and find how you're measuring those, and then be able to jump to your learning activities column and see how you're getting them there. And it goes all the different ways. I should be able to start at learning activities and find the learning outcome that matches or the assessment that matches. So this wheel is used in multiple different areas. So at the course level, at the module level, but it's a good visual to keep in mind as you're planning things, right? So oftentimes, maybe we inherited a class like we said last time, and they've always done this assessment, but we're not really sure why that assessment is happening or where it belongs or what it relates to. And sometimes there's assessments that we keep in because of the impact they make, right? So it might not be directly related, but there's an activity that we always do to set up something else. And it's okay to hold on to some of those things that, really you're passionate about and they work. But you do want to take a look at this alignment, and I think it helps really to ensure that you're not giving busy work, right? When you look at this wheel and you check between all three areas, you can ensure that what you are delivering and what you're asking of students is appropriate to get them to those course level learning outcomes. All right, so module level assignments and assessments. And again, Friday, we're going to be talking about those larger summative assessments, but for today, we're looking at module level assignments and assessments. So these are the ones that need to be aligned with your learning outcomes. So they should be aligned with your module level learning outcomes. And granted, your module level learning outcomes are also aligned with your course level student learning outcomes. So it all kind of plays together. But you want to take a look back and remember our backwards design model, right? This is the acceptable evidence to meet those desired results. The learning outcomes are measurable. So these assessments should be kind of that measure. These can be low stakes to high stakes. So a lot of times when you're developing module level assessments, you want the early modules sometimes to be a low stake chance to get to a more high stakes outcome, right? So if you're asking students to write a lesson plan, the first time they do that, it might be more of an activity to get them where they need to be, and then you'll assess it later on to meet an outcome. And also, if you remember the course map, you want to consider your grading strategy, both so you can figure out what you need to design. So do you need to design a rubric? Do you need to design a checklist? Would it be good to have some examples that are graded to help students? But also remember for you, so if you have a paper each week for 15 weeks, those add up, and that's a lot of grading. So thinking about what's practical both on the student side and your side, because time is valuable, and teaching online can, if you're teaching online or face-to-face, it's good to think about those extra pieces that get plugged in that you might not otherwise consider.
All right, and so now we're starting to fill out this course map a little more. And what you can see here is we've highlighted over in the kind of towards the right as you look at it, the assessment of mastery and the grading method. But I just wanted to point out one thing before I get there, is that what I've done now is I'd mentioned earlier that my cardiovascular module goes over 2 weeks. And so here I've split those outcomes between the 2 weeks. And so essentially, just for argument's sake here, we're doing the first 3 in the first week and the second 3 in the second week. So how am I going to know that the students have achieved mastery at this level? Then I'm going to be doing multiple choice, which is very typical for our field, where large content, large classes and exams that they have to take for graduate school or medical school or whatever type of school, they actually do need to take timed multiple choice tests. So it's okay for us to include these here, although we bloom our multiple choice tests. We make sure that they're reasonably complex. But that said, as they're practicing these skills within the modules, we're giving them, in this case, the multiple choice formative assessment questions, which are mostly lower level blooms, but as I say, they can go up and do more in-depth ones. But we also give them what we call data analysis questions, which are more clinical case studies with lab values, etc. in there. So that's more of a kind of short answer type of or calculations that they're doing there, not just the multiple choice. And so how I'm grading them is that this is actually a very low stakes activity at this point. We actually bring our students together in small groups and they work together as peers to go over the answers. So they've done them individually, they've handed them in to us, and they are not being graded on whether they're right or wrong, simply that they attempted the questions, and you can tell when it's a genuine question, because we wanted this opportunity to make them be unafraid of being wrong, because these are high stakes courses. If they don't do well in them, they are not getting into pharmacy school, they're not getting into medical school, etc., etc. So we wanted their formative assessments to be very low stakes and very supportive. And so we just wanted them to work together to figure out the right answer, to make sure that they got it wrong and they had an aha moment, and then they went on with confidence, so that when they got to their big cumulative one that is worth a lot of points, they had confidence in doing it. So those were weekly things. So as I say, they were peer graded following a discussion of the problem set. Now, as I say, these were large classes. So if you look over into the notes section, I can't do that for 240 students by myself. So I had TAs that worked with me, and I had to train them how to do this. I had to train them how to teach the complex points where the students fell down on, the basic kind of skill sets of teaching and explanation, and making sure that they understood all the key concepts, etc. And so I did that. Those are my formative assessments for week 1 and week 2. And then just for myself, I put a little note there saying my summative modules are actually not one big exam, one big cumulative thing at the end of the semester. I actually break my summative exams into kind of module level ones that naturally go together. And so the cumulative exam for my class, in this particular case, the cardiovascular section, which is module 2, is included with module 1 and module 3, because those things all go well together in my section. So I've just made a note of that there for myself. And also over into the grading method, I've said, okay, but in this case, when I'm actually grading those, we'll have the MCQ, the multiple choice questions are going to be machine read with bubble sheets. And for the data analysis clinical scenarios, I'm going to write up a model answer. I'm going to train my students how to interpret the model answer, because sometimes when you do that with a brand new TA and they look at your model answer, unless the student comes up with every single word in exactly the way you said it, in exactly the order that they that you said it, they mark the student down for that. So I had to do quite a bit of training for this too. So yeah, that's what I would do there. So we had started with our course learning outcomes, broke them down into weekly module learning outcomes, thought about the formative assessments, how they were going to be graded, and then just if it's appropriate to your course, thinking about whether there's going to be some kind of summative stuff there, or whether you're building up towards one big project or one big cumulative assessment at the end. That's entirely up to you, and it's entirely appropriate to your course and discipline.
And when you're planning, we're not sure what fall will look like, but it's good to plan in a way kind of like pie in the sky. If I had my dream course, no matter the modality, here's what I'd really like to do with students. Here's what I know from my practice works best and gets them to these outcomes. And then if we do go online, or if you have to transition online, let's work together at that point to transition those activities. So maybe you wanted to do a debate in class. We can sit down and look at the goals for that debate and either maybe change the assignment so that it can live in a different space, but still meet your outcome, or take it and just modify it and use one of the tools that we have here at OU to make it happen. So for any of this planning, learning activities, assessment, think or dream big. And then if we need to scale back later for whatever the reason, it's okay to work through that at a next step.
And also following up from that, at the beginning of August, when, you know, hopefully we have more information. I know that, you know, the administration is taking this very seriously, but they're obviously having to try to consider a very dynamic situation, and many things are changing as it goes. But we're hoping that the closer we get to the beginning of the semester, where everybody is able to know what our courses are going to look like. But with that in mind, at the beginning of August, we are going to be running sessions on using the tools and technologies that Jodie just alluded to. With once you know what you want to do, and now you're having to perhaps think about moving everything into the online environment, you'll be able to come to these next series of intermediate and advanced sessions with those assessments in mind and think about what that might look like and what tool might work well for you. So we're not just kind of throwing you out there, but we're just trying to make sure that it's appropriate, just in time teaching for what you might need going forward.
And on Friday, we're going to help you think through more of these authentic summative assessments. So it might be that you want to just plan kind of your course level or module level activities and assessments now, and then Friday think more about you know, planning out how and when you'll integrate those summative larger assessments. So you can take a look at it either way. Just know if you want to think or hold off on those bigger summative assessments until we can kind of think through things, then it's okay to just stick with your module level assessments here. Okay. So we're going to ask you to create some aligned module level assignments and assessments at this point. So you've hopefully made your module level learning outcomes for 1 or 2 modules. And now take some time to think about how you'll align just those module level assessments. And maybe you've taught this course before and you have your summative assessments and you want to work those in as well. Or you're one of the people who's scaffolded out those bigger assessments into smaller pieces as part of your modules, but really take a close look at that alignment and consider your grading strategy. So we'll give you a couple minutes, and we're hoping to have volunteers after you have some work time. So hopefully some of you will build up the courage today to share with the group. All right, we'll come back in just another minute. So finish up what you're working on. If you are trying to round something out. All right, do we have some volunteers just to talk us through maybe some of your module level learning outcomes and then the aligned assessments you had planned for students and what your grading strategy would be? Any volunteers?
I'll always feel that 10 seconds when you were first starting learning how to teach, and you would ask a question and you were waiting 10 seconds for somebody to ask. It felt like an eternity, and I think it feels like even more of an eternity in the online environment. But again, we're just all here to share ideas and to throw things out there. And if you're really proud of what you've done, please share it with the group. It's always really helpful. And if you're not sure if this is what you should be doing, please feel free. We all muddle through this messy business together. So please just, talk about whatever you would like to. But we also love hearing from, you're all very experienced, or most of you are very experienced, and sharing that experience with the group is so helpful if you'd like to be brave.
Okay, so I'll give it a shot.
Thank you.
Okay, so what I did is my learning objective for the student was to describe how neurons transmit sensory and motor information to elicit responses. And the learning activity that I created was that I will assign a pre-lecture module for them to complete in this type of module. Grading is the low stakes because it's about for them working through what that information will be like. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, so you use the word learning activity. You're assessing them working through it? I'm guessing this is an assessment more than a learning activity.
It's actually a turn-in activity. I can share on the screen what I've done.
It's up to you. I'm just so as we work through these, sometimes learning activities and assessments can go hand in hand, right? So sometimes learning activities are graded, but they don't have to be, and vice versa. But if it assesses that learning outcome, then that belongs in that assessment column.
Okay, so it's not a graded, it's more for them to work through the process of getting the different structures that are associated with the neuronal description. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so typically when we have a module level learning outcome, we want to assess that they've met that outcome. So if it's this, it sounds like you've developed a low stakes kind of learning activity, but maybe that assessment will come later. So in that assessment column, you may want to put, what week you're going to assess that learning outcome. So maybe that outcome is actually assessed in a later module. In some form of summative assessment. So just make sure you kind of take note of that. So as you're planning, you make sure when you are creating that later assessment that you circle back and wrap that in.
Okay.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah. So for everyone, and it's tricky kind of differentiating, and we haven't gotten to the learning activities yet. So thank you for taking, being courageous and sharing with everyone. But sometimes learning activities and assessments are blurry, right? But these assessments are more how we assess those learning outcomes. So how do we know our students have hit those learning outcomes? And that's a perfect point, Brenda. Sometimes we present a learning outcome to students in module 2, and we don't really assess it until later on because we need to develop it and get things started at module 2, and then they're ready to truly be assessed later.
Yeah, it's an excellent point.
Okay, do we have any other volunteers before we move on? Thank you, Brenda.
You're welcome.
Okay, I guess we'll move forward. So next, as That was a beautiful transition. We're going to talk about learning activities, and learning activities are how we get our students from point A to point B. So from where they are when they step in the door to our course or into a next module to where we want them to be at the end of that module or course. So at this point, we've identified our desired results. We've determined the acceptable evidence and created those assessments. And now we're planning learning experiences and instructions, or an instruction, not instruction, sorry. But at this point, remember, as always, remember that alignment triangle or circle or however you see it in your head, but these learning activities need to align with your learning outcomes as well as your assessments you've developed. This can also be materials and content. So what's nice about writing these module level learning outcomes, from my experiences, you can take a look at those and it helps guide you towards what you need. So maybe you have a topic you're working on and you know you need maybe 2 or 3 readings, right? And you want 1 or 2 of them to be peer reviewed and the other might be a book chapter. You don't at this point, when you're planning, have to decide what those are. So maybe you've worked with a couple different textbooks in the past and you're not sure. It's okay to be vague in your course map at the beginning. It's a living, breathing document and it should change over time and develop over time. So it's okay to put, 2 peer review articles and find those once you get through this planning stage. It's okay to put book chapter or find a video or create a lecture or find something. So it can be kind of general at the moment. And it can be, this is a planning process, right? So maybe you design it all out and you take a look and it's actually going to take students way too long to complete all the things you actually want to deliver. So being, planning on paper can help you think through what might be too much, how much can I expect of my students, and again, what do they need to get to reach that learning outcome. Learning activities can also be kind of a formative type of assessment, like Brenda presented earlier. So it can be something they work through, and maybe it's graded as participation, but less graded as summative assessment. So they're more low stakes, typically formative type things. These can also be class discussions, class activities you want to do, role plays, case studies, all those wonderful, engaging things we work on to get students to that assessment place. So learning activities can be graded, and sometimes, like I said, that learning activity and assessment can blur, but you really want to look at your outcomes. So if you have a measurable verb in your outcome, that assessment that measures that outcome should go in your assessment column. Same thing here as with planning assessments. Think pie in the sky. Think the best class I could ever teach, I would do it this way. And then if you're face-to-face and that's the way you planned it, great. If you're going to be online or in some form of blended class, you can work with the instructional designers or your colleagues because you have a number of really amazing people. If you're the Patton College or other places, to think about how that could be done in a different learning modality. But I find it's best to plan for what you really want to do and then work on figuring out how to make that fit, as opposed to just going with a tool or going with something because we have it and it'll be easier to plan it that way first.
And then just one last example. I just paused because I wasn't sure if I'd unmuted my mic. Here's my supporting learning activities. So I've broken down my module learning outcomes. And now I think, okay, so now I want to do a lecture. I want to introduce this new information to them in some way. Now that lecture might look different depending on your particular course and what is happening on campus. That might be a face-to-face lecture, or it might be, but if we're online and we have to be online, thinking about, does that lecture, must it be synchronous? Or can I actually do a pre-record of a short lecture that hits all of the key points. And even if that means taking what would normally be a very long lecture and breaking that down into little segments between 7 and 15 minutes to kind of keep the students' attention type of thing. So thinking about that, and sometimes actually, if it's a particularly complex thing, even in a face-to-face class, I will often do a little pre-record before that, before I meet them face-to-face, and I have them watch it so that they can stop, rewind, think about that again, come back to it again. And so by the time we all meet together, they've kind of had the opportunity to think about this complex stuff first. So when you come to think about your lecture part, thinking about what would I do if it was face-to-face, what will I do if it's online? And if it's fully online, just always remembering that it's easier for our students if as much as possible is asynchronous. If they have, if they're in a family where lots of people are using a computer and they can only get to it at one particular time of the day, or they have very poor Wi-Fi, or somebody isn't well, all kinds of other things. So for accessibility for our students, trying to keep as much of that content asynchronous as possible is very helpful for them. But whatever way you do it, you're introducing some new material. And then I'm also getting them to supplement that by reading specific chapters in the textbook that is a required textbook for the course. And I'm actually breaking that down into which particular parts of that chapter, because these chapters can be, 80 pages long, refer to the particular learning outcome. And that's easier for me than maybe for some, because my course is a very discrete section built. First you do this, then you do that, etc., etc. Yours might not be quite as, regimented as mine are here. And here's where we get to the next point that speaks to Brenda and Jodie's point of how a learning activity can also be an assessment of mastery, or some way that you're checking that the students are meeting your learning outcomes. Because I've listed here that a supporting learning activity are those tutorial questions, both the multiple choice and the data analysis and the big weekly discussions that go around that. And then just in the next section, the only difference there being for those weekly tutorials and discussions, how am I actually grading that? So in my particular case, it's a mixture of multiple choice questions and these kind of short answer types of things. But as Jodie and Brenda pointed out, that straddles across. A learning activity can be a very low stakes formative assessment as well. And then I just did the same thing. The one thing that you'll see up, I did the same thing for week 3 for the second part of this. You will notice that I've said journal article. If you go back to looking at the top of supporting learning activities, it says journal article. It's going to be a PDF and it's to be decided. And that's because for all of my sessions, I really like to get the students reading very current, peer-reviewed journal articles. And so I wait as long as possible for a brand new, hot off the press, incredibly relevant journal article, and then I pop it in there. So you can place hold like this, as Jodie mentioned. I want something in here. I think I'm going to try and find a video. I'm going to try and find something. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I'm just going to place hold it here for me to come back to later on.
And this again is a work in progress. So your course map may look like this when you begin. And then as you decide, okay, this lecture is going to be pre-recorded and I'm going to do it in 3 parts because there's a lot of content here. It may say lecture 1 and the topic, lecture 2, the topic, lecture 3, the topic, so that when you're creating that list of things you need to prepare, it's all right here for you. Same with discussions. Up front, you might just know you want to do a discussion or a voice thread or some activity. you may then add the prompts into this big planning document so that when you go to create your course in Blackboard or prepare things for students, it's all right here for you. I've also worked with some faculty who their assessment of mastery and learning activities are so blended together that they'll change this first column, and again, it's your document, so you need to use it how it works best for you, to learning materials, so readings, videos, podcasts, things that they're going to curate and create for students. And then this assessment of mastery is activities and assessment of mastery. So what the students will be asked to kind of consume, and then what the students will be asked to do and submit. And for online learning, a lot of our activities are assessed, so that has worked for many people, but this document, we've created it to support you, but that doesn't mean you can't go in and change it. That's why it's a Word doc. We expect you to use it so that you can best plan your course in a way that makes sense for you and that you feel it'll make sense for students when you deliver.
Jody, I have a question.
Yes.
If we go back to the previous one, you said that we can use our supporting learning activities also as supporting, what was the term that you used? Materials. Okay. So supporting materials, and then you will set up learning activities and mastery together?
Yeah, so
Okay.
if that makes sense for you because you're continually kind of assessing with those learning activities, it's okay to think about it that way. It just kind of depends. Different people see course mapping differently. So if that works better for you, we'd rather you spend time on planning the course than trying to figure out what goes in what column. So if that works best for you, do that for sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I think if you do move it around, just make sure your grading method is clear, right? So if you're doing a discussion, are you going to have a rubric for that discussion? Are you going to have a checklist? If you're doing a paper or a project, how will each of those things that you are putting grades in the grade book for being assessed? And I think that, you know, depending on these three columns, or these two columns are kind of blurry, so set them up how it works for you, and then just be clear on that assessment of mastery. So again, we want you to take a couple minutes, think about how you'll align some of your learning activities with the module level learning outcomes you worked on earlier, and with your assessments as well. You can, you know, think about readings, lectures, like we mentioned, anything you're planning on moving to that learning activity column. Okay, do we have anyone who would like to share with our group? I'll give you a couple seconds to volunteer, and if not, we will move on. And again, if you want to reach out to a designer or your peers and get feedback after this, it's always good to have an extra set of eyes and ears and get some feedback on these planning steps. So we as faculty and educators or instructors sometimes see things and it makes perfect sense to us, but getting that feedback can really be a useful tool to kind of just get different opinions of others. All right, so that's pretty much the course planning process. It is iterative. It will change, and you should expect it to change, and course to course and group to group you're teaching, things might change. But setting up a clear structure is a really great way to get started, especially if we do have to go to blended or online. You have everything mapped out and you'll be able to just think through each module and how we'll transition that to a new look and feel. So we suggest using this process. If you need help with it, again, you can reach out to an instructional designer. Our website does have bookable times if you're not sure who your instructional designer is. Those can be found on the Teacher Continuity Keep Teaching site. Or you can reach directly out to myself and I can get you started and send you in the right direction. So we hope that you all will join us Friday. We do have Lindsay Rudebra from the Experiential Learning Office coming to present with us as well. And we'll talk about creating authentic assessments. So if you will be joining us, we hope you come prepared with a summative assignment that's aligned with one or two of your learning outcomes that you've done in the past. And we'll talk about creating those really authentic learning assessments for your students. So thank you all so much for joining us. I hope to see you Friday. And with that, we'll take some questions if you have any.
For the summative assessments, are you looking for them to be relative to like a weekly learning outcome or a course and like a whole course-wide learning outcome?
Yeah, we're thinking more of those larger, big assessment pieces. So more of how you're going to be assessing those course outcome, a course level outcome or outcomes. So maybe you have a big piece that you use or a larger project where you tie in a couple different outcomes. So we're looking for those big pieces. It will relate. I mean, you can use what we talk about at the module level, but we're framing it around those larger pieces.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.